Daniel Ho opened his eyes and saw sawdust, fine and reddish. It lay right next to his face, his cheek pressed against the rough planks. It smelled of coal and burnt oil, not electric, but coal. That distinct smell you only get from a real furnace. He tried to take a deeper breath and coughed. The cold air stung his lungs. Metal clanged somewhere nearby. Someone was standing over him. Daniel turned his head and saw the boots first, worn, with brass buckles. Then a doublet, expensive fabric, but worn down to the threads at the elbows. Then a face. A boy, about 15 years old, pale. His lips pressed together so tightly they'd turned white, his eyes red from lack of sleep. The boy was speaking quickly, and Daniel realized with horror that he could make out every word. A stranger, a master craftsman. "Help, please." Daniel slowly sat down. Sawdust fell from his shoulder. Behind the boy stood an old man in a leather apron, gray-haired, hands covered in calluses. He held the chisel as if it were a hammer. His grip was wrong. His hand was wrapped. With that grip, he'd get tired in an hour and break his fingers in two. Outside the smithy window, a wall was visible, stone, crenellated. A keep. A real medieval keep. Daniel closed his eyes for 3 seconds. He opened them. The keep hadn't disappeared. The sawdust hadn't disappeared. The boy hadn't disappeared. All right, stay calm. An engineer works with what he has. What he has. His hands are intact. His mind was working. The blacksmith's shop. A boy with a problem. Let's start with the problem. Daniel brushed off his sleeve and looked at the boy with a steady gaze, the same gaze he'd used to look at the exhausted juniors at 3 in the morning when the assembly line had ground to a halt and the deadline was looming. He asked calmly, "Who's coming after you, and how much time do you have?" The boy froze. Then his face twitched. Then he began to cry, not out of fear but out of relief. The old man in the apron stepped forward and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. He called him "my lord" and said he needed to tell the whole story from the beginning. The boy nodded and wiped his face with the sleeve of his doublet. Daniel listened. "His name is Lord Aaron Calder. He is 15. His father died a month ago in a border skirmish at Rainhall Pass. The treasury is empty."
The army consists of 380 spearmen and 200 archers, not a single battle mage. The Khazard Empire has sent a note, a land survey. In Veldret's language, this means a soft takeover. In 6 months, the imperial governor will arrive here. In a year, Erlin will cease to exist. The Empire will deploy 8,000 soldiers and the Crimson Order, 3 combat mage orders. Archmages capable, on their own, razed a fortress to the ground single-handedly. Daniel listened and did the math. 380 against 8,000. A ratio of 1 to 21, without magical support, without allies, without money. In his past life, this was called a red project status, not orange, red, the kind where the manager calls at 3 in the morning and says the client is leaving in the morning. The old man introduced himself as Master Gilroy, the castle's engineer, the only one. He said he had summoned the stranger using a ritual from an old book. The book had been lying in the basement for 400 years. No one believed the ritual would work. Gilroy didn't believe it himself, but they had no other options. Daniel looked at his hands, the same calluses from the soldering iron on his index and middle fingers, the same scar on his left wrist from an old milling machine back in college. He hadn't changed. The world around him had. All right. He stood up. His legs held him steady. His head wasn't spinning. He asked to be shown the castle. The young lord nodded and led the way. Gilroy hobbled after him. Erlin Castle stood on a cliff overlooking the Sea of Grey Fangs. The north wind lashed against the walls so hard that the stones whistled. The courtyard,
A stable for 20 horses. Half the stalls were empty. The barracks. Soldiers sat against the walls. Their faces were gray. Their weapons were dull. No one had polished their blades. That was a bad sign. When soldiers stop polishing their weapons, they've already given up in their minds. A smithy. Daniel stopped in the doorway and looked around. A horn, an anvil, bellows, tools on the wall. Everything was old but sturdy. Iron in the corner, ordinary iron. And next to it, a separate stand. 5 ingots, black, with a slight bluish sheen. Daniel walked over and touched one. The metal was cold, colder than it should be at this air temperature, and smooth. Too smooth for an unprocessed ingot. He asked what it was. Gilroy said it was black iron. Mined in the mines beneath the Father's Ridge, the metal holds runes better than any steel, but few know how to work it. Daniel turned the ingot over in his hands. He tapped it with his fingernail. The sound was dull, solid. The structure was uniform, no bubbles or inclusions. He put the ingot back and moved on. The castle gate, the lifting mechanism. Gilroy said it gets stuck once every 7 or 8 turns. He curses the evil rune. Daniel looked at the mechanism, a chain drive, a drive sprocket, a driven sprocket, a drum. He crouched down and began counting the teeth. The drive sprocket. 1 tooth was chipped off by a quarter. Every 7th rotation, it skips a tooth and the chain seizes up. Daniel asked for some paper. Gilroy brought a piece of calfskin and a piece of charcoal. Daniel drew a diagram of the transmission. He calculated the gear ratio. He showed Gilroy the chipped tooth. He said to replace that gear and the gates would last another 100 years. Gilroy looked at the drawing. He looked at Daniel. The old man's face turned pale. He had been working on this mechanism for 30 years. For 30 years, he had thought the runic inscription was to blame. But it was the chipped tooth that was at fault. Silently, he picked up a tool and set to work on the gear. An hour later, the gate was working again, smoothly, without jerks, without a screech. The chain ran evenly, the drum spun. Gilroy slowly sat down on the floor of the smithy. He sat there. He looked up at Daniel and said to the young lord, "My lord, bring him to live with me. I won't let him go." The young lord looked at Daniel. There was something new in his eyes. Not hope. Hope is too strong a word. More like a shadow of hope. A hint that perhaps all was not lost. Daniel nodded. He didn't understand this world yet. He didn't know its laws. He didn't know its politics. He didn't know why he was here or how he'd ended up here. But he knew one thing. He had a task before him. The task had parameters, deadlines, resources, and limitations. And he had his hands and his head. That would be enough. It had always been enough. Daniel didn't sleep that first night. Gilroy took him to a small room next to the blacksmith's shop, a narrow cot, a mattress stuffed with hay, a woolen blanket that smelled of smoke. Daniel lay down and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was made of stone, marked with dark patches of soot. He lay there and thought, not about how to get back, which was a futile task without any input data, but about what he'd seen that day. Gears, chain drives, levers, all primitive but functional. The level of technology was roughly that of the 14th century, maybe the 15th. But there was magic. Magic changes everything. Magic is energy he doesn't understand. Not yet, anyway. He got up. He lit a candle. He took a piece of leather and a piece of charcoal. He began to write down what he knew, what he didn't know, and what he needed to find out tomorrow. The list turned out to be long. In the morning, Gilroy found him at the table. In front of Daniel lay 12 sheets covered with tiny symbols. Gilroy couldn't read them. Daniel was writing in English. He asked Gilroy to tell him about black iron, everything he knew. Gilroy sat down on a stool and began to speak. Black iron is mined only in the mines of Erlin, nowhere else on the mainland. The metal is colder than usual, denser, heavier, and it accepts runes. Ordinary steel holds a simple rune for a day or two. Then the rune fades and goes out. Black iron holds a rune for years. No one knows why. The mages of the Guild of Fire use black iron for their staffs and amulets. They pay 3 times as much for it as they do for ordinary steel. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he asked for 2 small pieces of black iron to be brought to him. Gilroy brought them. Daniel took the first piece. He asked Gilroy to inscribe the simplest rune on it, the simplest one possible. Gilroy scratched a symbol onto the surface. Nothing happened. The old man explained that the rune had to be activated. It required a drop of magical energy. He himself knew only minor spells, lighting a fire, mending a crack, very simple things. Gilroy placed his finger on the rune and closed his eyes. The rune glowed dimly, a bluish light, faint but noticeable in the semi-darkness of the smithy. Daniel watched. Then he asked Gilroy to inscribe the same rune on the second piece. Gilroy inscribed it. He activated it. The second piece also glowed. Daniel placed both pieces side by side. The light was the same. Then he placed one piece on top of the other.
The light grew brighter. He separated the pieces. The light returned to its previous brightness. He joined them again. The light intensified. Daniel froze. He looked at the 2 pieces of metal and saw not runes. He saw a circuit. 2 elements. Each has 2 states, active and inactive, glowing and not glowing. When both are active and connected, the result is amplified. It's an AND gate, the simplest logic element. It passes a signal only when both inputs are active. His hands began to tremble, not out of fear. It was the feeling an engineer gets when he sees the solution to a problem he hasn't even formulated yet. He asked Gilroy, "Is it possible to make a rune go out when there's another active rune nearby?" Gilroy thought for a moment. He said there was a negation symbol, a small minus sign. It's used to lock doors. When a key rune is nearby, the lock rune goes out and the bolt opens. Daniel asked him to demonstrate. Gilroy demonstrated. He inscribed the negation symbol on one piece. Now, when the 2 pieces lay side by side, one glowed and the other went out. Separate them and both glow. Connect them and one goes out. A NOT gate. D. Daniel now had 2 logical elements out of the 3 basic ones, and NOT. From these 2, you can build any logical circuit. Any. Every processor in the world is built from combinations of and NOT. That's the foundation. He spent the whole day in the forge. Gilroy brought pieces of black iron. Daniel cut them into plates. He marked them. Gilroy activated the runes. By evening, there was a structure on the table made of 12 plates connected by copper wire. Ugly, crooked, but it worked. Daniel pressed the first plate. A signal traveled down the chain. The last plate lit up. He let go. The light went out. He pressed it again. It lit up. It was an adder. The simplest single-bit adder. It added 1 and 1 and got 2. Gilroy looked at the structure and didn't understand what it was for. Daniel didn't bother to explain. It was too early for that. He asked for dinner and went to bed, for the first time in 36 hours. The next morning, a girl came to see him. She was about 15. Her hair was tied in a bun. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. She was holding a broken sword. She said it was her father's sword. To garrison commander, he'd died with the Lord at the pass. She wanted the sword repaired. Daniel looked at the blade. The steel was good. The break was clean. It could be reforged, but it would take 2 days, and the result would be inferior to the original. He told her that. She didn't leave. She said she'd wait. She sat down on a crate by the smithy door and watched him work. Daniel was working. He was assembling a second adder. It was more complicated than the first one, with 16 plates. The girl watched. An hour later, she asked what he was doing. He said he was counting. She asked what he was counting. He said nothing yet, teaching iron to count. She looked at him as if he were crazy, but she didn't leave. Her name was Mila West. On the third day, Daniel finished the second adder. It worked more reliably than the first one. An error occurred once every 30 cycles. For a first prototype, that was acceptable. Now he needed a program. Not an electrical one, not a digital one, a physical one. He took a piece of waxed leather, thick, flexible. He ruled out a grid on it and began punching holes with a sharp awl. Each hole was a 1. Each solid cell was a 0. 4 columns.
Each row was one command. The first command, forward. Second, stop. Third, turn. Fourth, strike. A punch card. The first punch card in the history of this world. Gilroy stood behind him and watched. The old man said nothing. He had seen how, in 3 days, the stranger had done with black iron what no mage had done in 1,000 years. Not because Daniel was smarter than the mages, but because the mages looked at black iron and saw material for runes. Daniel looked and saw a transistor. On the 4th day, Daniel requested an audience with the young lord. Gilroy led him through the castle courtyard to the main hall. The hall was large and cold. The stone walls were hung with tapestries bearing the coats of arms of the vassal houses. A long table made of black oak. People sat at the table. The young Lord Aaron sat on a high chair. A woman sat beside him, about 24 years old. Her back was straight. Her dark hair was held back by a silver net. Her face was calm. Her eyes were attentive. She looked at Daniel as if she were examining a machine. This was Lady Ivrain Calder, the late lord's cousin, regent to the young heir, the de facto ruler of Ayr. 4 others sat at the table, barons, vassals of the house of Calder, old men, mustached, with heavy hands and heavy gazes, and the captain of the guard, Sir Orthan, broad-shouldered, a scar across his left eyebrow. He looked at Daniel as if the boy had stolen his horse. Ivrain said that Master Gilroy had reported on the repairs to the gates. The council wanted to know what else the foreigner had to offer. Daniel looked at the faces around the table. The barons didn't believe him. Sir Orthan despised him. The young lord held out hope. Ivrain waited. He began to speak, simply and directly. He said he knew about the threat to the Khazard Empire. He knew the balance of power. He knew that Erlin had no mages. But Erlin had black iron, and he could make soldiers out of it, not living ones, iron ones, who never tire, who are fearless, who never flee, who carry out orders precisely and without error. The hall was silent for 3 seconds. Then one of the barons laughed. He called it a farce. He said that a craftsman was proposing to replace knights with pots. A second baron nodded. Sir Orthan stood up and said that his soldiers would not allow some blacksmith from nowhere to put iron dolls in place of living warriors. It was an insult to every man who held a spear for Erlin. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He waited for them to finish speaking. Then he looked at Ivrain. She was silent. She was looking at him, waiting. He said one thing. He said he wasn't suggesting replacing the soldiers. He was suggesting giving every soldier an iron partner who would take the first blow. One who would take his place in the ranks where a man would die in a minute. One who would stand on the wall at night in a blizzard when a living sentry would freeze to death. Erlin's soldiers would not become unnecessary. They would become twice as resilient. Sir Orthan sat down, not because he agreed, but because he couldn't think of a counter-argument right away. Ivrain turned to the young lord. Aaron looked at her. She gave a slight nod. The boy said he was giving Master Ho 1 month. 1 month and access to the black iron reserves. In a month, he must present a functioning iron soldier. If he did, he would receive a workshop, apprentices, and everything he needed. If not, he was free to leave. Daniel nodded. A month. A good deadline. Tough, but not impossible. He returned to the forge. Mila was sitting on her crate, waiting. He walked past her and began to work. First things first, he needed a frame, the golem's skeleton. He picked up a piece of coal and began sketching on the smithy floor. A bipedal design, about 2 meters tall, a low center of gravity for stability,
4 hinge points on each leg: hip, knee, ankle, and foot. The arms were simpler: 2 hinges, shoulder and elbow. No need for a hand. Instead of a hand, a mount for a weapon: a sword, a shield, a hammer, anything. Modular design, standard components: leg type A, arm type B, hinge type 3. If one component breaks, an apprentice can replace it in 10 minutes. No archmage needed, just a kid with a bag of spare parts. Gilroy looked at the blueprint and shook his head. He said it was impossible. Metal doesn't move, metal stays still. Daniel said the metal would move because he'd show him how. He spent 3 days drawing up the plans. He recalculated the loads. He redrew the hinges. On the 5th day, he began forging. Gilroy helped, silently. The old man didn't understand half of what Daniel was doing, but his hands knew iron better than anyone else's in the castle. Daniel told him what was needed, and Gilroy did it. On the 10th day, Mila asked if she could help. Daniel looked at her. A 15-year-old girl, slender arms but strong fingers, and attentive eyes. He told her to sort the black iron scraps by size. The work was tedious but important. Mila didn't argue. She worked silently and precisely. By evening, all the scraps were arranged in 7 piles, strictly sorted by size. Daniel nodded. Good. The next day, he gave her a more difficult task: to cut the waxed leather into cards of uniform size, evenly, without any unevenness. Mila cut, evenly, no unevenness. He gave her an awl and showed her how to punch holes along the markings: 4 columns, each hole exactly in the center of the square. She punched the first card in 20 minutes. Crooked. 2 holes were off-center. He pointed out where she'd gone wrong. She punched the second one. Better, 1 misalignment. The third, perfect. He took all 3 cards. He threw away the first one. He threw away the second one. He placed the third one on the table. He said it was the first working punch card not made by his own hands. Mila looked at the card, then at him. She didn't say anything. But the next morning, she arrived an hour early. In the evenings, Daniel went to the main hall. Not because he wanted to. Ivrian had asked him to. She said the court needed to see a foreigner. He had to get used to it, otherwise rumors would devour him before the Empire did. He sat at a long table. He ate bread and boiled lamb. He listened to the Baron's conversations about grain prices and whose 3rd son was marrying whose 2nd daughter. Ivrian sat next to Lord Aaron. She followed every word. She corrected the boy discreetly, quietly, so the Barons wouldn't notice. Daniel noticed. He noticed that she wasn't eating. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes. He noticed that the candle on her workbench burned down to a stub every night. She worked just as hard as he did, only her work wasn't with iron, it was with people. And people were harder to fix than gears. On the 18th day, the golem stood up. Not right away. At first, it stood on supports in the center of the forge, 2 meters and 10 centimeters tall, black iron and ordinary steel. The hinges were lubricated with whale blubber. The chest chamber was open. Inside was an adder with 32 plates. 4 commands: move, turn, strike, wait. Daniel inserted the punch card into the chest chamber. He closed the lid. Gilroy activated the runes. Light ran across the plates. The golem twitched. Its left leg stepped forward. The support fell. The right leg stepped forward. The golem began to walk. Crookedly, unevenly, lurching to its left side. 3 steps. 4. On the 5th step, it crashed into the smithy wall and kept shuffling its feet in place until Daniel opened the chamber and removed the card. Gilroy was sitting on the floor. He was sitting on the floor because his legs wouldn't hold him up. The iron was walking. The iron was striding through the smithy, and it didn't take a single battle mage to make it happen. Just the old man with the small symbols and the stranger with an awl and a piece of leather. Mila stood in the doorway. Her hands were shaking. Daniel looked at the golem. He said that the left hip joint had 3 degrees of play and the calibration needed to be redone. Then he sat down and began rewriting the punch card. He spent the next 4 days repairing it. He replaced the joints, he recalibrated the adder, he rewrote the cards. The golem fell 11 times. On the 12th try, it walked from one wall of the smithy to the other. 6 steps. Exactly. Without any obstacles. It turned around, walked back. It stopped exactly at the starting point. Daniel wiped his hands with a rag and told Gilroy he needed a name. Gilroy asked why the metal thing needed a name. Daniel said it wasn't a name, but an index number. Unit 1, the first prototype. Gilroy shrugged and said, "All right." Unit 1. On the 23rd day, Daniel brought Unit 1 into the castle courtyard. The sun was shining. The wind from the sea carried the scent of salt. The golem stood in the middle of the courtyard, gleaming in the sun. A crowd had gathered around it, soldiers, servants, stable hands, and 2 barons who were guests at the castle. Sir Ortan stood in the front row, his arms crossed over his chest. The young Lord Aaron sat on the balcony. Ivrain stood beside him. Daniel inserted the card. Gilroy activated the runes. Unit set off. Across the courtyard, in a straight line. It reached the wall, turned, walked along the wall, turned, walked back, an octagonal route, smooth, precise. Its steps were heavy and measured. The stone slabs of the courtyard hummed beneath its iron feet. The crowd was silent. Unit completed the circle and stopped at the starting point. Silence. Then one of the stable hands gasped. Then a murmur began. Daniel wasn't listening. He was looking at Sir Orton. The captain of the guard was looking at the golem. His face was stony. Then Orton turned and walked away, in silence. That was bad. Orton's silence was worse than a scream. A scream can be shouted down. Silence builds up. That evening, Ivrain came to the smithy for the first time. She walked in and stopped at the door. She looked at Unit. She looked at the table, cluttered with blueprints and scraps of iron. She looked at Daniel. He was sitting on a stool, polishing a spare hinge. His hands were black with iron dust. She said the council had discussed the demonstration. 2 barons were impressed. One believed it was witchcraft and that he should be burned. Sir Orton filed a complaint. He demanded that the foreigner be expelled. The young lord refused. Orton left the hall without saying goodbye. Daniel asked what she thought. Ivrain paused. She said she had only one thought. If a golem can walk around the courtyard, it can stand on the wall. If it can stand on the wall, her soldiers won't have to stand on the wall at night in the freezing cold. If her soldiers aren't standing on the wall at night, they'd be better off fight better during the day. She thinks practically. He nodded. He said he needed more black iron, much more, all the reserves from the mines. And he needed apprentices, at least 5, people who know how to work with their hands and aren't afraid of new things. She said the iron would be provided. The apprentices were a different matter. Craftsmanship is considered inferior to the military. No nobleman's son would ever go to a blacksmith shop, and the sons of commoners aren't taught to read and write. Daniel said he didn't need literacy. He needed hands and attention. He'd teach them the rest himself. Ivrain looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she'd find him some people. She left. Daniel went back to the hinge. Mila was sitting in the corner, sorting punch cards. She had heard the entire conversation. She said quietly that Ortan wouldn't let it go. He believes that golems are a disgrace. That a true defender of Erlen is a soldier with a spear, not a pot with runes. And many in the garrison feel the same way. Daniel said he knew. He said that the best way to convince a soldier is to save his life. Until he did that, Ortan had every right to be skeptical. On the 25th day, Unit broke down. The right knee joint seized up. The golem stood in the middle of the courtyard and wouldn't move. Soldiers walked by and smirked. One kicked the golem in the leg and said that the great iron warrior had tripped. Daniel heard this. He came out of the smithy. He opened the chest compartment. He took out the circuit board. He inspected the joint. The bushing was worn out. Sand had gotten into the gap. He replaced the bushing in 40 minutes. He inserted the card. The golem started walking. The soldier who had kicked the golem was standing nearby. Daniel looked at him and asked calmly, "When your boot breaks, do you think walking is pointless?" The soldier didn't answer. Daniel returned to the smithy. That night, he didn't work on the golem. He worked on something else. He took a piece of black iron, a thin one, and polished it. He assembled the mechanism, a small one, with a spring and a gear. He attached it to a base into which he placed an oil wick. The wick would rise on its own when the flame grew weak. It would lower when the flame was too high. Automatic brightness control, the simplest form of feedback. He worked until dawn. In the morning, he placed the lamp on a tray. Next to it, he laid a waxed leather card. He wrote on it in the local language, which he had already begun to learn. "Ivrine's lamp, for this table only. Do not give it to anyone." He asked a maid to take it to the regent's chambers. The maid carried it away. Daniel returned to his work. That evening, Ivrine did not come to the smithy. She did not send a note. She did not send a message. But Gilroy said in the morning that he had seen a light in her window until late at night, steady, unflickering. The new lamp was working. By the end of the first month, Daniel had 5 apprentices. Ivrine kept her word. 2 sons of blacksmiths from town, a former carpenter, a miner's widow who had worked sorting ore for 10 years and knew black iron by touch, and Mila. She didn't ask for permission. She just showed up in the morning and stood at the workbench. Daniel looked at her. He looked at Gilroy. Gilroy shrugged. Daniel gave her an apron. He divided up the work. Gilroy was in charge of forging the body parts. It was hard work. Heat it up, strike it, bend it, cool it, check it. 2 blacksmiths helped him. A carpenter made molds and templates for standard components. A miner's widow named Sarah worked with black iron. She cut plates, she sanded them, she prepared blanks for rune patterns. Mila punched punch cards. Daniel designed. He calculated, he drew, he assembled schematics. He activated the runes together with Gilroy. And he taught. Every evening he gathered everyone in the forge and explained. Not magic, logic. He drew on the wall with charcoal. Here's a plate. It has 2 states, lit and unlit. These are 1 and 0. From 1 and 0, you can build any number. From numbers, you can build a command. From commands, a program. From a program, behavior. The apprentices listened. Not everyone understood, but everyone memorized it. Mila understood faster than anyone else. She wasn't just punching cards, she began to see patterns. One evening, she told Daniel that there was an extra step in the patrol program. The golem made 2 turns where 1 would suffice. Daniel checked. She was right. He removed the extra step. The golem began to spend 9% less time on the route. 9%. A small thing, but when you have 100 golems, 9% is 9 extra minutes for each one. Over the course of a day, that's 15 hours of free time for regrouping. Mila didn't understand the scale of what she'd done. Daniel did. In the second month, problems began. Sir Ortan didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He acted more quietly. The garrison soldiers began refusing to help in the forge. Previously, 2 spearmen would haul iron from the mine every day. Now they'd stopped. Ortan said they were on training exercises. The coal carts were delayed. The stable hands wouldn't provide horses for trips to the mines. Minor obstacles. Each one was understandable on its own. Together, they formed a barrier. Daniel didn't complain to Ivrane. He didn't complain to the Lord. Instead, he did the math. How much iron was needed for a single golem? How long would it take to forge it? How much coal for smelting? And he went to see Ortan himself. He found him in the training yard. Ortan was drilling the spearmen. Form up, strike, turn, form up, strike. Daniel stood and watched for 10 minutes. Then he approached. He said he wanted to propose a deal. Ortan looked down at him. The captain was a head taller.
Daniel put it this way. His soldiers haul iron and coal, and in return, Daniel makes each of them a new spearhead, out of black iron, which doesn't dull or rust. Orton was silent. Daniel added, and one black iron breastplate for the captain of the guard himself, made to measure. Orton looked at him. Then he smiled, for the first time. He said the blacksmith knew how to bargain. That was unexpected. He said he'd think about it. The next day, 2 spearmen were hauling iron again. Daniel kept his word. In a week, he forged 30 spearheads. The black iron was hard to forge, but the result was worth it. The spearheads were sharper than steel and lighter. Orton received his breastplate. He tried it on. He shrugged his shoulders. He didn't say thank you, but he nodded. That was the beginning. Not friendship, not trust, but a truce. Daniel worked with people the same way he worked with machines. He found the point of friction. He eliminated it. He moved on. In the middle of the 2nd month, a caravan arrived. 12 carts, black iron from the deep tunnels. Sarah examined every ingot. She rejected 4. She said these ones had inclusions of ordinary rock. The runes on them would be unstable. Daniel checked. She was right. He began to trust her more. By the end of the 2nd month, the 2nd golem stood in the forge. Index 2. An exact copy of Unit 1, but with improved joints. The play had been cut in half. A new wax and fat-based lubricant that Gilroy had suggested. Daniel inserted the card. The golem started moving. Smoother than Unit 1. Quieter. Its steps were more precise. Gilroy watched him, his eyes shining. He turned to Daniel and said quietly, Master Ho, for 30 years I've been forging horseshoes and gate hinges. For 30 years I thought that was the pinnacle of my craft, and now my hands are making something that will outlive me. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The next day, news arrived from the border. Scouts reported that the Khazar Empire was massing troops at the southern pass. A vanguard of 2,000 spearmen was advancing toward the Rheinhall Pass. It would be there in 4 months, perhaps sooner if the winter was mild. 4 months. 2 golems. Daniel sat down at the table. He looked at the blueprints. He looked at the iron supplies. He looked at his hands. He did the math. If they worked 16 hours a day, and if the apprentices reached full productivity, and if the iron kept coming without interruption, then there would be 30 golems by the deadline, maybe 40. Not enough. But he remembered what he'd told himself on the first day. An engineer works with what he has. He picked up a piece of charcoal and began sketching a new diagram. Not just one golem, a production line, a conveyor belt. The first conveyor belt in the history of this world. The conveyor took up half the castle courtyard. Daniel remodeled the old granary next to the smithy. He tore down the partitions. He moved the grain to the cellar. He set up 10 workbenches in a row. Each workbench represented a single operation. The first table was for forging the blanks. The second was for grinding. The third was for cutting hinges. The fourth was for assembling the legs. The fifth was for assembling the arms. The sixth was for assembling the body. The seventh was for installing the chest chamber. The eighth was for cutting black iron plates. The ninth was for assembling the summing unit. The 10th is for activating the runes and testing. Every apprentice knew their own operation, and only their own. Gilroy walked between the workbenches, checking the quality. Mila sat at a separate table, punching punch cards. By this time, she could punch 1 card in 8 minutes without any errors. Daniel kept track of the time. The assembly line started running on the 3rd day. The first golem rolled off the line in 4 days, the second in 3, the third in 2.5. People were learning. Their hands were getting used to it. Mistakes were becoming fewer. By the end of the 3rd month, 12 golems were in operation. 12 units, identical, standard. Each followed the route recorded on its punch card. Each stopped exactly at the point where the card ended. Daniel conducted the evening inspections. He checked all 12.
He examined the hinges. He checked for play. He changed the lubricant. He recorded wear and tear. Each golem had a logbook, a sheet of waxed leather on which Mila recorded the inspection date and the condition of each component. Gilroy called the golems his grandchildren. He talked to them. He told number 3 that he creaked, and that creaking was shameful. He told number 7 that he was doing well and walked more smoothly than anyone else. Daniel didn't object. So be it. That same week, a woman arrived at the castle, tall, broad-shouldered, with burns on her forearms from elbow to wrist. She walked into the forge and stopped. She looked at the workbenches, at the assembly line, at Gilroy, who was assembling a hinge, at the golem standing by the wall, waiting to be activated. She said her name was Brana Holt, from the free city of Holtgard, a blacksmith. She'd heard a rumor that in Erlen they were working with black iron in a new way. She'd come to see for herself. Daniel looked at her hands, the hands of a blacksmith, a real blacksmith. Calluses in all the right places, burns, both old and fresh. She knew what a bellows was. He gave her a piece of black iron and a hammer. He told her to give it a try. She took the iron, weighed it in her hand, placed it on the anvil, struck it once, looked at the mark left by the blow, struck it again, turned the piece, struck it a third time. Daniel counted the blows. 15 blows, and she had shaped it into a hinge plate, not from a blueprint, just by instinct. The plate was even, smooth, with right angles. Gilroy needed 30 blows for the same job. Daniel told her she was hired. She laughed, loudly, so loud that the tools on the wall rattled. She said she hadn't agreed yet, but she stayed. Brana transformed the production process. She forged twice as fast as Gilroy and 1.5 times more precisely, and she could feel the metal, literally. Daniel watched as she held the blank and turned it, listening to the ring. Once, she set a plate aside and said this one was no good. There was a crack inside. Daniel checked it. He broke the plate open. There was a crack inside, a hairline crack, invisible from the outside. Brana had detected it by the sound of the hammer. With Brana, the production line sped up. 1 golem in 2 days, then in 1.5. By the 4th month, 28 golems were in service. Daniel was counting. There were 2 months left until the pass. 28 wasn't enough. They needed at least 50 to defend the narrow pass. Better yet, 100. He increased the shifts. Now the forge worked from dawn until midnight, 2 shifts. Gilroy led the day shift. Brana led the night shift. The apprentices rotated. Milo worked both shifts. Daniel had forbidden her to do so. She didn't listen. She came in for the night shift and sat down at the table with the punch cards. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. She stayed. At the end of the 4th month, what Daniel had been waiting for happened. The first skirmish. Not with the Empire, with bandits. 30 men, a band of deserters from the southern provinces. They attacked the village of Milnichi Brody, a 2-hour horse ride from the castle. The village was small, 40 households, no garrison, no walls. But a patrol unit was stationed near the village, 5 units. Daniel had sent them a week ago. The patrol route was simple: circle the village perimeter, 8 checkpoints, 1 lap every 40 minutes. Upon contact with an armed person not wearing a cloak bearing the Erlen crest, switch to combat mode. Combat mode was simple. Step forward, strike with the shield. Step forward, strike with the shield. Repeat. The bandits entered the village at dawn. The 5 units were stationed on the northern side of the perimeter. The nearest golem detected movement. No, it didn't see it. It didn't have eyes in the conventional sense. The detection rune reacted to metal within a radius of 20 steps. The bandits' swords and axes triggered the rune. The golem turned. It moved. The punch card switched to the combat sequence. Step, shield strike. Step, shield strike. The first bandit was sent flying 3 meters. The second tried to hack at the golem with his sword. The sword bounced off the black iron and snapped in the guard's hand. The golem struck with its shield.
The bandit fell. The 5 units operated in sync. 1 card, 1 program, 1 behavior. They marched in a line and struck. Not quickly, not agile, blunt and unstoppable. The bandits fled after 10 minutes, those who could run. Not a single person in the village was killed. Not a single one. When the messenger brought the news to the castle, Daniel was sitting at the table eating porridge. He listened. He nodded. He asked if any of the golems had been damaged. The messenger said one had a dented shoulder plate. Daniel told them to send an apprentice with a spare. Then he finished his porridge. Gilroy sat beside him and wept, quietly. The old man wept because his grandsons had saved the village, his iron grandsons, whom he had helped assemble. 2 days later, a woman arrived from Melnice Brody, a peasant woman, young, with a child in her arms. She was carrying a pie, a honey pie, wrapped in canvas. She found Daniel in the blacksmith's shop. She set the pie on the workbench. She said that the golem had stood by her barn all night after the attack. He stood there and didn't leave. Her daughter had been sleeping in that barn with the lambs. The golem stood there and kept watch, not because anyone had ordered him to, because the punch card told him to stand at point 6 until the next shift. The golem didn't know he was guarding a child, but the child was alive. Daniel took the pie. He said thank you. The peasant woman left. He stood there with the pie in his hands, looking at it. Then he cut it up and handed it out to his apprentices. He kept a small piece for himself. Brana chewed on the pie and looked at him. She said he was a strange man. Daniel asked why. She said that any other master in his place would have gone to the hall and told everyone that his golems had saved the village. He nodded and said that the golem wasn't his doing. The golem was the sum of their labor. Gilroy forged it. She sharpened the tools. Mila punched the map. Sarah cut the plates. They all saved the village together, not him alone. Brana looked at him. She fell silent for 10 seconds, then she walked silently into the workshop. Daniel didn't understand why she had left so quickly. He hadn't noticed that her expression had changed. He rarely noticed faces at all. He noticed mechanisms. News of Miller's Ford reached the Council of Barons in 3 days. It reached the Empire's border in 10. Daniel found out about this when Ivrain came to the smithy that evening. She sat down on a stool by the wall. For the first time, she didn't stand. She sat down. That meant the conversation would be a long one. She said she'd received 2 letters. The first was from Baron Torvain. He used to be against golems. Now he's asking for a patrol to be stationed at his estate. He's willing to pay in iron. The second letter came from abroad. It was from a merchant in Cassard. He wrote that at the Emperor's court they were discussing Erlin's mechanical knights. The Crimson Order had sent an investigator. The investigator's name was Magister Velen Cray. Daniel asked who that was. Ivrain explained. Cray isn't a battle mage, he's an analyst. His job is to understand the enemy, find their weakness, report back to the Order, then the Order destroys them. Cray has never been wrong. 7 campaigns, 7 victories for the Order based on his recommendations. Daniel nodded. So now they weren't just going to crush him, they were going to study him. That was worse. You can survive being crushed. Being understood is harder. He asked Ivrin how long it would be before the vanguard arrived. She said 2 months, maybe less. The southern passes are already passable. The snow is melting early this year. 2 months, 36 golems. He needs 100. He counted again. Even with Brana and the 2 new apprentices Ivrain had sent, he wouldn't make it in time. Unless he simplified the design. He spent the night poring over the blueprints. By morning, he'd made a decision. 2 types of golems. Type A, a full-fledged unit, 2 meters 10, a full set of joints, full functionality for the front lines. Type B, a simplified version, 1 meter 80, hinges only in the legs. The arms are immobile, a shield firmly attached to the left hand. The right hand is simply a rod with a weight at the end. No complex movements. Step forward, stand. Step back, stand. A living wall.
Type B can be assembled in a single day. 1. He showed the blueprint to Gilroy. The old man looked at it. He said it wasn't a warrior, it was a pillar with legs. Daniel said he didn't need a warrior, he needed a wall. A wall that stands in the narrow pass and doesn't move. 8 men in a row. That's the width of the front at Rheinhall. 8 Type Bs in the first row, 8 in the second, 16 units behind to strike the flanks when the enemy gets bogged down against the wall. Another 20 in reserve. A total of 64 just for the pass. The rest are guarding the villages and the castle. The assembly line was reconfigured in 2 days. Now the line split in 2 at the 6th table. The left branch assembled complete units. The right branch produced simplified B-types. Brana led the right branch. She called the B-types dummies, but she forged them with the same precision as the full units. A week after the conveyor was rebuilt, a man arrived at the castle, alone, on a raven black horse. He wore a traveling cloak without any coats of arms. His face was calm, his eyes were cold and light. He requested an audience with the young lord. He introduced himself as Velen Cream, Master of the Crimson Order and diplomatic envoy of the Khazard Empire. Daniel was in the smithy when he was told. Mila ran in and said it all in one breath. "An Imperial investigator, here, in the hall." Daniel set down his tools. He wiped his hands. He looked at his palms, black with iron dust. He didn't wash them. He went into the hall just as he was, wearing a leather apron with dust on his hands. Cree sat at the table across from the young lord. Ivrain stood behind Aaron's chair. Sir Orthan stood by the door, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Cree was drinking wine, calmly, as a guest, not as an enemy. Daniel entered. Cree turned. He looked at him, at his apron, at his hands, at his face. He smiled. He said that he was finally seeing the famous Master Ho, that rumors of his Iron Knights had reached the imperial capital, that he'd come to see the miracle with his own eyes. Daniel sat down at the table. Ivrain frowned slightly. A craftsman does not sit at the table with a diplomat. But Daniel did not know this rule, or perhaps he knew it, but did not deem it necessary to follow it. Cray wasn't offended. On the contrary, his eyes grew more attentive. He suggested a game of chess. He said he'd brought a board with him. Daniel looked at the board. The pieces were made of bone. The board was polished wood. He nodded. They played. Cray played well, academically correct. Daniel played strangely. He sacrificed pieces early and often. He gave up pawns as if they were worthless. Cray took them without noticing how his position was narrowing. By the 20th move, Daniel had 8 pieces left compared to Cray's 13. But his 8 controlled the center. Cray looked at the board, then at Daniel. He said he understood. Master Ho doesn't fight with numbers. He fights with position. Interesting. Daniel moved a pawn. Cray leaned back in his chair. He spoke seriously, without a smile. Master Ho. In the Empire, he would have had an academy. 1,000 students. Complete freedom. The best materials. Everything he needs to work. But here, in a year, he'll die of exhaustion defending a boy who isn't even his son. Daniel looked at the board, then at Cray. He said the boy wasn't his son, but he was his client, and he sees a job through to the end. Cray was silent for a moment, then he nodded. He said he respected that, and he made his move. Daniel won the game on the 32nd move. Cray left the next morning. He politely said goodbye to the Lord. He politely nodded to Ivrain. He politely waved to Daniel from the saddle. Daniel stood on the wall and watched as the rider disappeared behind the hill. Ivrain stood beside him. She said quietly that Cray now knew everything he needed to know. He had seen the forge. He'd seen the courtyard with the golems. He'd counted them. He'd assessed the production rate. He'd report the exact figures to the order. Daniel said he knew. She asked why then he'd let him in. Daniel said he hadn't let him in. Cray would have found out anyway. Spies,
Merchants, deserters, information leaks out. But now Cray saw only what Daniel wanted him to see. 36 units in the courtyard, Type A.
Cray didn't see the workshop where Branna forged the Type Bs. He didn't see the basement where Mila stored 200 punch cards. He didn't see the new lubricant that doubled the service life of the hinges. Cray left with the numbers, the right numbers, but incomplete ones. Ivrain looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was thinking like a spy, not like a blacksmith. Daniel shook his head. He said he thought like an engineer. An engineer always knows which documentation to show the client and which not to. 6 weeks before the Imperial Vanguard approached the Rhine-Hall Pass, Daniel sat down to count. 47 Type A units, 31 Type B units, 78 golems. Not 100, but close. That would be enough if the pass were narrow. He summoned Mila and asked for a map of the pass. Mila brought an old map from the castle archives. The leather was cracked, the ink had faded, the scale was imprecise. Daniel looked at it and shook his head. You can't plan using this map. We need a new one, an accurate one, with distances in steps, with elevation marks indicating the width of the passage at every point. Ivrain said there was a woman at the castle, a wandering cartographer from the eastern archipelago. She got stranded there in the winter. Her embassy perished on a mountain pass. She was the sole survivor. She's been living at the castle for 4 months now. She draws maps in exchange for food and a room. Daniel asked for her to be brought to him. The woman arrived an hour later. She was short. She had slender hands. Her dark hair was braided into a tight plait. She remained quiet. She bowed. She introduced herself as Sunjial. Daniel asked if she could draw a map of the Rhine-Hall Pass, an accurate one with distances. She looked at him and asked just how accurate he meant. He said down to a single step. She wasn't surprised. She said she'd need 3 days in the field, an escort of 2 soldiers, and good charcoal for drawing, not the junk they'd given her at the castle. Daniel looked at Ivrain. Ivrain nodded. 3 days later, Sunjial returned. She placed the map on the table. Daniel unfolded it and froze. The map was perfect. Every rock, every turn, distances down to a single step, elevations down to a span. The width of the passage was marked at 14 points. The narrowest spot was 7 people abreast. Not 8, as he'd thought. 7. That changed the calculations. Daniel stared at the map and did the math. Then he looked at Sunjin. He told her that her precision was exactly what he needed. No more, no less. She didn't answer, but she straightened up slightly. He asked her to stay. He said he needed a system of signal posts to control the golems at the pass. Each post had to be visible from the previous one. Each had to be positioned at a point that couldn't be shot through from the road. He needed a map of lines of sight. She listened. She nodded. She asked how many posts. He said at least 6. She said she'd make 8. It was more reliable that way. If one post fell, the line of communication wouldn't be severed. Daniel looked at her more closely. She was thinking like an engineer. Redundancy, redundancy, fault tolerance. She didn't know those words, but she understood the principle. Sunjin left to work. Daniel returned to his preparations. He needed to solve the main problem, control. 78 golems meant 78 punch cards. Each card determined their behavior. But the battlefield was unpredictable. The enemy changed tactics. Formations broke down. Flanks were exposed. Daniel couldn't write a single card to cover every scenario. He had no conditional branches. His golems couldn't make choices. They did exactly what was programmed. Period. So he needed a library of cards, a set of programs for every situation. A head-on attack, holding a position, retreating, regrouping, flanking the left, flanking the right, and a team of people who would change the cards manually. On the run, in the heat of battle, under a hail of arrows. He gathered his apprentices. He explained the task. Each of them had to be able to change a punch card in 30 seconds. Open the chamber, remove the old card, insert the new one, close the chamber. 30 seconds, no more.
He timed them. Mila's first attempt took 45 seconds. Too long. He redesigned the chest compartment's latch. 2 movements instead of 4. Flip it back, turn it, compartment open. Mila tried again. 32 seconds. Close. 1 more time. 28. Good. He trained all 5 apprentices for an hour every day. Within a week, each of them could swap the card in 25 seconds with their eyes closed. This was his army. Not golems. People. 5 runners carrying bags of punch cards. Each was responsible for a group of 15 machines. At Daniel's whistle, they ran to their groups and changed the program. 78 golems changed their behavior in 2 minutes, simultaneously. An entire regiment received a new order in 120 seconds. No general in the history of Valdred could have reorganized an army that quickly. At the same time, Daniel was solving another problem: supply. The golems ran on the magical energy of runes. Runes aren't eternal. Even on black iron, a rune would lose its brightness after 12 hours of continuous operation. After 24 hours, the golem would stop. They needed recharging. Gilroy could reactivate the runes. His minor runes were enough to power 1 golem for 10 minutes. 78 golems meant 13 hours of continuous activation. 1 old man, 13 hours. Impossible. Daniel found a solution. He noticed that the runes charged faster when other active runes were nearby. Resonance. The effect he'd seen on the first day when 2 pieces of black iron glowed brighter together. He built a charging station, a black iron frame, 20 slots. A golem was placed in a slot for 4 hours. The frame resonated with its runes and recharged them. Gilroy only had to activate the frame, once a day, 10 minutes. 20 golems were charged in 4 hours, 4 shifts a day, 80 golems a day, with room to spare. Gilroy looked at the stand and said quietly that in 40 years of work, he'd never once thought about rune resonance. Daniel said that resonance wasn't magic, it was physics. A wave amplifies another wave when their frequencies match. It doesn't matter if it's a magical wave or a sound wave. The principle is the same. Gilroy shook his head. He said that Master Ho sees the world differently than anyone he'd ever known. Daniel said he sees the world the way he was taught to, and that he could teach others to do the same. Gilroy looked at him, then at Mila, who was punching a card at the next table, then at Brana, who was forging in the night shift workshop. He nodded and said nothing. 3 weeks before the Vanguard's arrival, the first attempt on Daniel's life took place. Night, the forge. He was working alone. The apprentices had left. Gilroy was asleep. Brana had finished her night shift and gone to her room. Mila had left too, though she'd tried to stay. Daniel sat at the table writing a new punch card, a retreat program. The golem takes a hit exceeding the threshold. The damage rune activates. The golem takes 3 steps back and stops. It waits to be replaced. Simple logic, but on the card it took up 20 lines. He heard a footstep, quiet, behind him. He turned around. A man was standing in the doorway, a dark cloak, a hood, a knife in his hand. Not a long one, a boot knife, for a quiet job. Daniel didn't have time to stand up. The man stepped forward. Daniel knocked the table over onto him, a heavy oak table with 20 kilograms of iron. The table struck the killer in the legs. He stumbled. Daniel grabbed the first thing within reach, a hammer. Not a combat hammer, a blacksmith's hammer, 1.5 kilograms. He swung it down from above. It hit the shoulder. The killer cried out. The knife flew from his hand. Daniel struck again. This time, he didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the knee. He hit it. The assassin fell. Daniel pinned him down. He held him down. He shouted. A minute later, a guard ran up with a torch, then a second one. Then Sir Orton, in just a shirt and with his sword drawn. The assassin was tied up. He was interrogated in the morning. A mercenary from Cassard, bribed through an intermediary.
His mission was to kill the foreign master craftsman and take all the blueprints and punch cards from the forge. The client's name was not revealed, but Daniel already knew. Cray worked quickly. After the first assassination attempt, Ivrain insisted. Daniel needed a bodyguard. The young lord agreed immediately. 2 days later, a woman named Heron arrived at the castle, a mercenary swordswoman from the southern steppes, silent, of average height, but she moved in a way that made her seem taller. A saber at her belt, an old one, with a crack in the guard. Daniel noticed the crack on the very first day. Heron stood 2 steps behind him and remained there, silently. She stood behind him in the smithy, behind him in the hall, behind him in the courtyard. She didn't speak, she didn't smile, she didn't complain. She did her job. Daniel got used to her in 3 days. She became like a shadow, quiet and constant. On the 4th day, he noticed her warming up in the courtyard that morning, saber forms, quick and precise. He wasn't looking at the beauty of the movements. He was watching her grip, her right hand, her index finger slightly higher than usual, her little finger lower. A non-standard grip, adapted for a short guard and a light blade. Her saber was made for a different grip, the standard one, so she was adapting to the weapon instead of the weapon adapting to her. A week after her arrival, there was a second assassination attempt. This time, 2 assailants, in the courtyard, in broad daylight. Arrogance or desperation. They were walking toward Daniel as if they were petitioners, ordinary clothes. One was carrying a basket as if it contained a gift. Haran saw them before they were even 10 steps away. She stepped forward. She stood between them and Daniel. She placed her hand on her saber. The 2 stopped. Then the first one dropped the basket and drew a knife. Haran moved so quickly that Daniel didn't see the saber come out of its sheath. He saw the result. The first one was lying on the ground. The second one ran off. Haran didn't chase after him. She stood between Daniel and the man who had fallen. She looked around. She was looking for the third one. There was no third one. Daniel stood there staring at her, at the saber in her hand. The crack in the guard had grown longer. One more strong blow and the blade would break. He said nothing. That night, he hadn't been working on the golems. He'd been working on the saber. He'd taken the black iron, the best piece from saws. He ran the calculations, blade length, weight, balance, the shape of the guard to fit her grip. Not standard. Hers, with a tall index finger and a short pinky. He forged it for 6 hours. Gilroy helped in silence. The old man could tell this wasn't a commission. It was a gift. By morning, the saber was ready. Black iron with a bluish sheen. Light, well-balanced, the guard fitted to the millimeter. Daniel placed the saber on the table by the door of his little room. In the morning, when Haran came to take her post, she saw the saber. She picked it up, weighed it in her hand, gripped the hilt. Her fingers fit as if the guard had been cast to fit her palm. She looked at Daniel. He grumbled that it was more comfortable that way, and went back into the smithy. Haran stood with the saber in her hand, alone, in the empty hallway. She stood there for a long time. Then she sheathed the saber. The scabbard was old and didn't fit properly. She tied it shut with a belt, and she followed Daniel, 2 steps behind him, as always. 3 days later, there was a third assassination attempt, this time not a knife, poison. In the water they'd brought to the smithy. Heron snatched the jug before Daniel could drink it. She sniffed it, poured it out onto the floor, said one word. Poison. Daniel looked at the wet floor, then at her, said, "Thank you." She didn't reply. After the third attempt, Ivrain convened a council. She said that someone in the castle was working for the Empire, a traitor. How else did the poison get into the smithy? Sir Ortan flushed. He said that the accusation of treason concerned his men and he demanded proof. Ivrain said coldly that she wasn't accusing anyone, for now. But everyone who enters the smithy will now be logged. Every jug of water will be checked, and if the traitor is found, the punishment will be according to the law of the mark, without mercy. Daniel sat in silence. He wasn't thinking about the traitor.
He was thinking about the fact that there were 2 weeks left until the pass. 83 golems.
The maps are ready. The stands are loaded. The runners are trained. Sonjian has finished the map of the signal posts. Hareen is standing behind him. Ivrain is guarding the lock. Mila is punching the maps faster than anyone else. Brana forges tirelessly. Gilroy activates the runes. Everything is ready. Or perhaps not everything, but there's no time to spare. An engineer works with what he has. He stood up and said that in the morning he would begin moving the golems to the pass. The move took 4 days. The Rheinhall Pass lay a half-day's walk from the castle. Half a day for humans, a full day for golems. They moved slowly, step by step. The stone road hummed beneath their iron feet. The column of 83 machines stretched for 1.5 kilometers. 10 Type A units led the way. Behind them came the main body of Type B units. Another 20 units brought up the rear. Runners flanked the column. 5 apprentices carrying bags of punch cards. Mila led the right flank. She carried a bag with 80 cards and a spare strap to secure it. Daniel rode on horseback. He didn't sit well in the saddle. Hareen rode beside him. She sat well in the saddle. Sir Ortan led the infantry, 100 spearmen and 80 archers. The rest remained at the castle. Ivrain remained at the castle. She stood on the wall and watched the column depart. Daniel looked back once. He saw a small figure on the wall. Then he turned back around. The Rheinhall Pass. Daniel saw it and immediately understood why Sonjian had redrawn the map 7 times. The terrain was treacherous, a mountain pass between 2 rocky walls. The pass was 400 paces long. Its width varied. At its widest point, 12 men could walk side by side. At its narrowest, 7. The ground was rocky. It sloped northward. The walls were vertical. It was possible to climb them, but it would be time-consuming and noisy. Daniel dismounted. He walked the pass from start to finish. He counted his steps. He checked them against Sonjian's map. The map was accurate to the step. He marked 14 points. Then he gathered the commanders, Ortan, Mila, Gilroy. Heron stood behind him. He spread the map out on a rock. He outlined the plan. First line, 7 Type Bs at the narrowest point. The wall, shields closed, defense strategy. Step forward upon contact, step back under pressure. Second line, 7 Type B units behind the first line reserve. When a first-line golem is taken out of action, a Type B from the second line steps forward. Replacement within 30 seconds. Third line, 15 Type A units. Strike force. When the enemy becomes bogged down in the first 2 lines, the units flank them and strike from the sides. Fourth line, Ortan's archers on rocky ledges. They shoot over the golems' heads. Fifth line, 10 units in reserve, in case of a breakthrough. Ortan listened. His face was stony. Then he said the plan wasn't bad, for a blacksmith. Daniel looked at him. Ortan smirked. For the first time, it wasn't a malicious smirk, more like weariness. He said he'd position the archers himself. He knows the ledges. He knows the angles. He used to shoot from them back when he was a young corporal. Daniel nodded. Fine. Everyone does what they do best. 3 days to prepare. The golems are in position. The programs are loaded. The runners know their routes. The charging station was set up in the rear, just past the bend in the pass. Gilroy activated the runes every 12 hours. The station hummed quietly and steadily. The Sonjian signal posts were operational. 8 locations. Flag up, information is coming in. Flag down, all quiet. The first signal came on the 4th day. Southern outpost, flag up. Movement on the road, a large column, spears, banners, red on black. Cassard. Daniel stood at the command post, a flat rock on a rise from which the entire pass was visible. A table, a map, a stack of punch cards, 2 inkwells, spare map blanks, and all. Mila nearby, ready to run at a moment's notice. He looked down. The vanguard was emerging from around the bend in the road. Spearmen, row after row, shields, helmets. Behind them, cavalry. Behind the cavalry, supply wagons. Many. 2,000, maybe more. Daniel counted the rows. 16 in a row. 20 rows in the first block. 320. Behind them, another block. And more. He stopped counting. Enough. He knew there were more of them, far more than his own vehicles. The Imperial commander also saw the pass. He saw the black figures standing in the passage, 7 across, motionless. The vanguard stopped. They stood there for an hour. Then they sent out a reconnaissance party, 10 horsemen. They rode up to 300 paces. They looked. They returned. Another hour of silence. Then the Imperial horn, a long, low sound. The first charge. 300 spearmen advanced, in formation, shields closed. Daniel watched. 300 men against 7 pieces of iron. By any logic of this world, the battle should have been over in a minute. The spearmen entered the pass. They marched in step. Good discipline, a professional army. They reached the front line. The first row struck with their spears. The blow struck the shields of the Type B units. A clanging sound echoed through the pass. The spears bounced off. The black iron wasn't even scratched. The Type B units stepped forward. Program, contact, step, shield strike. The first row of spearmen was sent flying backward. The second row crashed into the first. A crush. The Type B units stepped forward again. Strike, step, strike. The 7 machines moved in perfect synchrony. One rhythm, one speed. A step and a strike every 4 seconds. The spearmen couldn't pierce the shields. They couldn't get around them. The walls of the pass wouldn't let them. They couldn't retreat. The rear ranks were pressing forward. Daniel kept track of the time. 10 minutes, 20, 30. The Imperials retreated. Horn, retreat. The first assault had been repelled. Not a single golem was damaged. Daniel didn't celebrate. He looked at his watch. Primitive, water-powered. Son Jin had made it at his request. 4 hours and 12 minutes until the first line's lubrication shift. The Imperials would return sooner. The second assault began 2 hours later. This time, heavy infantry, 2-handed swords, axes. They hacked at the shields. The black iron rang out but held firm. One Type B unit took an axe blow to the knee joint. The joint jammed. The golem stopped. Mila ran. Daniel timed it. 23 seconds. She reached the damaged golem. A runner from the second line was already pushing a replacement forward. The damaged Type B stepped aside. A fresh one took its place. The formation held. The Imperials fought for 3 hours. Then they retreated again. Casualties. Daniel watched from the heights. Bodies lay on the rocks of the pass. Many. He didn't count them. He didn't want to count. They were people. But they had come to kill his men, and his machines stood between them. The third assault. Cavalry. Heavy horsemen in full armor. Horses wearing bards. They charged into the pass at full gallop. Daniel whistled. The runners took off. A change of tactics. 30 seconds. The front line changed their strategy. Instead of strike and advance, it was now drop to one knee and brace. 7 Type Bs dropped to one knee and angled their shields out. The horses crashed into the wall of shields. A thunderous crash. Dust, the screams of horses. The first horse fell. The second flew over it. The third stumbled over the fallen horse. A pileup, a stampede. Cavalry in a narrow pass is not a weapon. It's a trap for the riders themselves. Daniel knew this. The Imperial commander did not. Or perhaps he knew but was counting on sheer numbers. The numbers didn't help. 4-12. Daniel whistled 3 times. General withdrawal of the first line. Lubrication change. The runners took off. Type Bs withdrew 20 paces. The second line took the first line's place. Gilroy was already waiting in the rear. The apprentices removed the shields.
They lubricated the hinges. They checked the runes. 12 minutes. The first line returned. The Imperials did not attack during those 12 minutes. They were gathering their wounded.
By sunset, the Empire had lost 600 men, killed and wounded. Erlen had lost not a single one. 4 golems were damaged, 2 were repaired in the field within an hour, 2 were sent to the rear to have components replaced. 81 golems stood in the pass, black, motionless. Imperial soldiers watched them from the camp. Daniel stood on a rock and looked at the Imperial camp. Thousands of lights. They won't leave. Tomorrow again, and the day after tomorrow. And he knows that somewhere in that camp, Valon Cray is sitting and writing down everything he saw today, and thinking. Daniel was thinking too. He sat down at the table. He picked up an awl. He began to punch out a new map. He'd need a different tactic for tomorrow, because Cray had already figured out today's. The second day at the pass began in silence. The Imperials didn't attack in the morning. They didn't attack at noon. Daniel sat on the command rock and waited. Heron stood behind him. Mila sat nearby, shuffling through the maps. Ortan walked along the ledges, checking on the archers. Everyone was waiting. Daniel didn't like to wait. Waiting meant the enemy was thinking, and a thinking enemy is more dangerous than one that attacks. By midday, the southern signal post relayed a new signal. Not 1 detachment, 3. The Imperials had split up. The main column was still stationed in front of the pass, but 2 detachments of 300 men each had headed east and west, a flanking maneuver. Daniel looked at Sunjan's map. The eastern slope, steep. The ascent was possible, but would take 6 hours. The western slope, more gradual, 4 hours. If the flanking group reaches the ridge, it will come out behind the enemy's defenses. Daniel whistled. Mila ran up. He dictated the order. 10 units from the reserve to the western slope, 5 to the eastern. Program, Mountain Patrol, map number 12. Mila ran to the runners. 3 minutes later, 15 units left their positions and headed for the slopes. The units moved over the rocks, heavily but confidently. Their iron legs didn't slip on the wet rock. They weighed 3 times as much as a human and dug into the slope like anchors. Ortan watched and shook his head. He said his soldiers would have climbed faster. Daniel agreed. But his soldiers don't get tired after an hour of climbing, and they don't fall from an arrow. Ortan said nothing. By evening on the second day, the flanking group on the western slope encountered 10 units. A battle on a mountain ledge 4 steps wide. The units stood in rows of 2. The Imperials tried to get past. They couldn't. The ledge was too narrow. There was no way around it. They couldn't jump over it. The only way was through the iron. They couldn't get through the iron. By nightfall, the flanking group had retreated. On the eastern slope, the Imperials didn't even reach the ridge. 5 units stood on the trail and waited. Imperial scouts spotted them from above. They turned around. They left. Cray was counting. Daniel knew this. Cray sat in his tent and took notes. Numbers, speed, behavior, weaknesses. And he'd already found one. On the 3rd day, the Imperials didn't launch an infantry attack. They brought in trebuchets, 3 of them, heavy siege machines. Stones rained down on the pass. The first stone struck a Type B unit in the 3rd position. The golem was blown to pieces. Black iron is strong, but nothing can withstand a 200-kilogram boulder falling from a height. The second stone, the 3rd. In an hour, Daniel lost 6 golems. 6, irretrievably, smashed, beyond repair. He sat on a rock and watched as the trebuchets methodically pelted his line. Mila stood beside him. Her hands were shaking. She asked what to do. Daniel thought. The trebuchet fires once every 5 minutes. 3 trebuchets means a stone every 100 seconds. 18 stones in an hour. Accuracy is about 1 in 3. 6 hits per hour. In a day, he'll lose his entire first line. He had to take out the trebuchets.
But they were positioned behind a hill, 300 paces from the entrance to the pass, out of range of the archers, out of range of the golems. Or maybe not. Daniel looked at the map. He looked at the western slope. He looked at the reserves. 20 Type A units in the rear. He took an awl. He drew up a new map in 7 minutes. The program was called Battering Ram. The instructions were simple. Run in a straight line, maximum speed, don't stop. A golem ran slower than a human, but a golem didn't stop for arrows. It wasn't afraid of cavalry. It didn't veer off course. 20 units emerged from the pass on the western side. They rounded the hill and ran toward the trebuchets. The Imperial Guard protecting the trebuchets consisted of 50 spearmen. They saw 20 iron figures running toward them across the open field. They formed a line. They raised their spears. The units did not stop. They crashed into the formation. The spears snapped. The units cut through the formation like a knife through bread. They reached the trebuchets. Program: Ram. Run in a straight line. Impact. The first trebuchet collapsed from the collision with 4 units at once. The second toppled over. The third caught fire when a golem knocked over a brazier of coals next to the wooden frame. The Imperial soldiers fled. Daniel stood on a rock and watched. 20 units stood amid the wreckage of the 3 trebuchets, motionless. The program ended. The last line on the map. Stop. Wait. Mila ran toward them with new maps. Return program. The units turned around and headed back. By evening on the 3rd day, the Imperial vanguard had retreated. They hadn't left. They had retreated 2 kilometers and set up a fortified camp. Daniel tallied the losses. 14 golems destroyed, 9 damaged, 60 operational. Ortan's men suffered no losses. Not a single one.
Ortan came to him that evening. He stood beside him. He was silent for a minute. Then he said he was taking back his words. All of them. The ones he'd said at the council, the ones he'd said behind his back. All of them. Daniel looked at him. Ortan held out his hand. Daniel shook it. The captain's palm was rough and warm, the hand of a warrior. They stood on the rock and looked at the Imperial camp. Thousands of lights. The Empire won't leave. 3 days is a delay, not a victory. Cray had already figured out how the golems worked. Next time, he'd come with mages. The truce lasted 9 days. The Imperial camp stood 2 kilometers from the pass. Smoke from the campfires rose every day. Reinforcements were arriving. Daniel counted the plumes of smoke. Their number was growing. The main forces were on their way. 8,000. He had used every single one of those 9 days. The production line in the castle ran around the clock. Brana hadn't slept for 20 hours. Neither had Gilroy. New golems arrived at the pass every day. 2, 3, once 4. By the end of the truce, 90 golems were back in action. But Daniel knew that sheer numbers no longer mattered. Cray had seen through his tactics. He'd seen the limitations. He'd seen that the golems were slow to react. He'd seen that they couldn't handle the unexpected. The next strike would be different. He was right. On the 10th day, a horseman carrying a white flag rode up to the pass. A letter from the Imperial commander. An ultimatum. Erlin would surrender the pass. Master Ho would be handed over to the Empire along with the blueprints and technology. The young lord would retain his title and lands. The terms were generous, more generous than Erlin deserved by Imperial standards. Daniel read the letter. He sent it to Ivrain via a messenger. She replied 4 hours later. 1 word. No. Young Lord Aaron signed it. Daniel smiled when he read it. The boy had learned to say no. On the 12th day, the mages arrived. Daniel saw them from the command stone, 3 figures in crimson cloaks. They walked at the head of the column. They took their time. Mages of the Crimson Order, the very ones said to be as powerful as a regiment.
Daniel didn't know magic. He didn't understand it, but he understood energy. Mages are sources of directed energy: fire, lightning, wind.
So he needed protection against energy to counter them. He had spent the previous 9 days not only assembling new golems, he'd been working on shields, a new type of shield, a double-layered one. The outer layer was ordinary steel. The inner layer was black iron with a dispersion rune, the very same negation rune that Gilroy had shown him on the first day. The rune didn't stop magic completely, but it dispersed it, transforming a concentrated strike into a broad, weak field. A bolt of lightning striking a shield with the negation rune became a spark, not harmless, but not fatal either. He wasn't sure it would work. Theory was one thing, practice was another. He didn't have a mage to test it on. The first Crimson Mage raised his hands. A fireball the size of a barrel flew toward the line of golems. Daniel clenched his teeth. The ball struck the shield of the first Type B golem. A flash. The heat reached the command stone. Daniel covered his face with his hand. When he opened his eyes, the Type B was still standing. Its shield was glowing red-hot, but the golem stood. The dispersion rune had worked. The fireball had splattered across the shield instead of burning right through it. Daniel exhaled. The mages struck again. And again. 12 fireballs in 10 minutes. 3 golems were taken out of action. The shields had melted. The hinges had seized up from the heat. But the line held. 9 out of 12 strikes were deflected. The mages stopped. Daniel saw one of them turn to another. They hadn't expected it. They hadn't expected a blacksmith from the Northern March to find an answer to the Order's magic. Cray had expected it. Daniel was sure of it. Cray stood somewhere in the rear, watching, and thinking about his next move. The battle raged on until evening. The mages took turns with the infantry, a magical strike, then an infantry assault, then magic again. Exhaustion. No breakthrough. Exhaustion. Cray realized that Daniel couldn't be broken in a single day, but he could be broken in 10. 3 or 4 golems lost every day. In 20 days, the line would collapse. Daniel was counting. Cray was counting. Both knew that the math was on the Empire's side. That evening, Daniel sat in the command tent, alone. Heron stood at the entrance. He looked at the map, at the stack of punch cards, at his hands, black with dust, trembling with exhaustion. He hadn't slept for 3 days. Mila came in. She brought bread and water. She set them on the table. She looked at him. She said quietly that he needed to sleep. He shook his head. She said that if he died of exhaustion, none of this would make any sense. He looked at her, a 15-year-old girl, dirty, tired, with calluses on her fingers from the punch cards. She stood in front of him and told him to sleep. He smiled. "All right, 2 hours." She nodded. He lay down on the dirt floor of the tent, closed his eyes, fell asleep instantly. Mila sat down next to him. She picked up an awl. She picked up the blank card. She began punching the card. That very one. The evacuation program he hadn't had time to finish writing. She knew which lines were needed. She'd been punching cards for half a year. She saw the logic. She saw the patterns. She finished the card in 20 minutes. She checked it 3 times. There were no mistakes. She placed it next to the sleeping Daniel and left the tent. Haran looked at her. Mila looked at Haran. 2 women, one with a saber, the other with an awl. Both were guarding one man, each in her own way. Daniel woke up 2 hours later. He saw the card next to him. He picked it up. He looked at it. Every hole was in place. Every line was correct. He recognized Mila's handwriting. Her holes were slightly smaller than his, neater. He slipped the map back into the stack. He didn't say anything to her. She wasn't expecting any words. On the 14th day of the fighting, Daniel sent a messenger to the castle, not to Ivran, further, beyond the borders of Erlen. 3 messengers in 3 directions. To the kingdom of Mjolm in the east, to the duchy of Waldmar in the north, to the free cities of the western coast. The letters were identical. Daniel wrote them himself,
brief and to the point. Erlin holds the Rheinhall Pass. The Khazard Empire is advancing. If Rheinhall falls, Mjoln, Waldmar, and the Free Cities will be next. One by one, the Empire will not stop. It never stops. But Erlin offers a choice, an alliance. The small kingdoms of the north against the Empire of the south. The price of the alliance is simple: iron, coal, people. In return, Erlin will provide technology, golems for every ally, protection that doesn't depend on mages or the nobility, protection that depends on labor. The messengers have left.
Daniel returned to the pass. The fighting continued. Every day, 2 or 3 golems were lost. Every night, Brana forged replacements. The assembly line in the castle never stopped. But the pace of production couldn't keep up with the losses. Slowly and inexorably, the line was dwindling. On the 18th day, 62 golems remained in the ranks. On the 20th, 54. Daniel sat up at night drawing maps, new tactics, new programs. Every day, Cray found a counter to yesterday's tactics. Every night, Daniel devised tomorrow's. A race. His brain against Cray's. Engineer against analyst. On the 22nd day, a reply arrived from Mjoln. The king of Mjoln agreed to negotiations, but not to an alliance, not yet. He wanted to see proof. Daniel crumpled the letter. Then he smoothed it out. Then he wrote a reply. He invited the Mjoln ambassador to the pass, let him see it with his own eyes. On the 25th day, the ambassador for Mjoln stood on the command stone next to Daniel and watched as 47 golems held the pass against 2,000 imperial soldiers. The ambassador was an old warrior, a battle-hardened one. He had seen many battles, but he had never seen an iron wall withstand the onslaught and not retreat. The ambassador left. A week later, a convoy arrived from Mjoln. 20 cartloads of iron, 10 cartloads of coal, 40 craftsmen, and a letter. An alliance. Mjoln was entering into an alliance with Erlin. On the 28th day, a reply came from Waldmar. It was also a yes. The Free Cities remained silent, but 2 allies were enough. Mjoln sent 300 spearmen. Waldmar sent 200. Orton accepted them and positioned them on the flanks. The line was reinforced. But Daniel knew that infantry was a temporary measure, not the solution. The solution had to be something else. He sat in his tent at night. He looked at the map. He looked at the stack of punch cards. He looked at the piece of black iron he always carried in his pocket, cold, smooth. And suddenly he heard it, not with his ears, with something else. A rumbling, quiet, low, constant, coming from beneath the ground, from beneath the rock, from the depths of the mountain. He placed his hand on the floor of the tent. The rumbling became clearer, rhythmic. 1, 2, 1, 2. Like binary code. 0, 1, 0, 1. He froze. Every punch card emits a faint resonance when it's running. The black iron remembers. 90 golems had been working here for a month. 90 punch cards had been clicking away in their chest chambers for 10 hours a day. Thousands of cycles. Thousands of repetitions of binary code. And the black iron beneath the mountain had been listening and memorizing. And now it was responding. Daniel closed his eyes. He listened closely. The hum wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, a repeating pattern, like a processor's clock signal. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Something beneath the mountain was waiting. It had been waiting for 1,000 years, and now it was waking up, because for the first time in 1,000 years, someone had spoken to it in its language, the language of zeros and ones. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked at the punch card in his hand. He looked at the mountain. And he understood. He wasn't just building golems. He was writing an operating system. Each card was a command. Each golem was a terminal. And together, They were all loading code into the ancient computer beneath the mountain. He didn't know what to do with it, for now. The 30th day of the defense. 41 golems in action. Casualties were mounting. The mages of the Crimson Order had learned to strike with greater precision. They were aiming for the joints, for the weak spots. Cray had tipped them off. Daniel knew this from the pattern of the blows. Each ball flew not at the shield, but at the knee, at the elbow, at the chest cavity. Cray had analyzed its design using blueprints he'd reconstructed from his observations. Every weak point had been found, every one marked. Daniel sat on a rock and counted. 41. Tomorrow, 38. The day after tomorrow, 35. In 10 days, the line will collapse, and then 8,000 will enter the pass. He hadn't slept for 4 days. His eyes were burning. His hands were shaking. Mila brought him water and bread. He ate mechanically. He couldn't taste anything. Haran stood behind him, saying nothing. Orthan held the flanks. His soldiers were tired. Milm's and Valdemar's soldiers were too. Everyone was tired. Daniel looked at the mountain. The rumbling hadn't stopped. It had grown louder over the last few days. The apprentices could hear it too. Mila said the stones beneath their feet were vibrating. Gilroy said the runes on the charging station were glowing brighter than usual, without him activating them, on their own. The black iron beneath the mountain was awakening, but Daniel didn't know how to speak to it. It spoke the language of punch cards. 4 commands: move, turn, strike, wait. A primitive language, childish babbling, and what lay beneath the mountain was an ancient computer. It didn't need babbling, it needed a command. On the 31st day, Cray made his move. The Imperials brought an elemental onto the field, a high-order fire elemental. Daniel saw it from the command stone and realized that everything that had come before was just a warm-up. The elemental was enormous, 10 meters tall, a figure of living flame. The heat reached the pass 100 paces away. Rocks cracked beneath its feet. Imperial soldiers stood 200 paces behind. Even for them, the heat was unbearable. The elemental was advancing toward the pass, slowly, majestically. A single mage of the Crimson Order stood behind it, controlling it. His hands were raised. His face was pale with strain. Controlling the elemental was draining all his strength, but one elemental was enough. No black iron shield could withstand direct contact. The dispersion rune works against magical attacks. The elemental doesn't strike, it simply burns. A temperature of 1,000 degrees. Any metal would soften, any hinge would melt. Daniel watched. He counted. He thought. In 10 minutes, the elemental would reach the front line. In 15, it would melt it away. In 30 minutes, it would destroy everything. He couldn't stop it. There was nothing he could do. He had no magic. He had no power. He had only logic and iron, and whatever was rumbling beneath the mountain. He looked at Mila. She was staring at the elemental. Her face was pale. Her lips were pressed together. He looked at Ivrain. She wasn't here. She was in the castle. But he knew what she was thinking about him right now. He looked at Haran. She was standing nearby, her hand on her saber, ready to fight, ready to die, for him. And then Daniel laughed softly. Mila looked at him in horror. He laughed because he saw it. He saw the solution. Not in tactics, not in the program, in language, a rhythmic signal. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Beneath the mountain lay a processor, ancient, enormous, and it was waiting for one thing: synchronization. His golems were clanging their shields in battle. Every strike of a shield is a beat. Every beat is a pulse. If all the golems start striking at the same time, in a single rhythm, in that very rhythm he hears from beneath the mountain. Resonance. Resonance amplifies the signal. 90 punch cards created background noise, but the synchronized strike of 40 shields will create a directed signal, a command. Don't move. Don't turn. Don't strike. Don't wait. The 5th command. one that didn't exist in his language. Compile. Gather everything the black iron had memorized over 1,000 years, all the fragments, all the echoes, all the commands it had received from his punch cards, and execute. He sat down on a rock. He picked up the awl. His hands didn't tremble. For the first time in 4 days, his hands were completely still. He punched a single punch card, freehand, without a ruler, without markings, from memory and on a whim. The card was unlike the others, a different pattern, a different structure. Not a command for a golem, a command for a mountain. He inserted the card into the command golem's chest chamber. Unit 01, the Elder, his first golem. The very one that had once crashed into the wall of the smithy. He looked at Mila. He said one word. Chore. Mila ran. The runners ran. Whistles, shouts, 30 seconds. 41 golems received the command, the chore program, and 41 golems simultaneously raised their shields and began pounding on them in unison. A rumble, low, powerful. The stones beneath their feet trembled. Tick, tock, tick, tock. A binary rhythm, 0, 1, 0, 1. The mountains responded. The earth cracked. In more than one place, cracks spread from the pass to the foot of the mountain, thin, glowing with a bluish light. The very same light that made the black iron runes glow. The cracks spread like the roots of a tree, deep, down, into the depths of the rock. The elemental stopped. The mage who controlled it lowered his hands. He stared at the ground. The Imperial soldiers froze. Daniel stood on the rock and felt the vibration. It traveled through his legs, through his body, through his bones. The entire pass hummed like a single giant string. Then the rock split open. It didn't collapse. It opened up like a door. Something slowly rose from the crack. First, a hand. Black, made of black iron, covered in runes. Every rune glowed. Thousands of runes, millions of lines. The hand was the size of a tower, then a second hand, then the shoulders, then the head. A golem, 30 meters tall, black as night, with eyes like 2 blast furnaces. Orange light poured from its eye sockets. It stood waist deep in stone and stared. Daniel stared at it. The golem stared at Daniel. Silence. Absolute. Even the wind stood still. And then Daniel heard it, not with his ears, in his head. One word, clear, distinct, like a line of code displayed on a monitor screen. Compiling. The ancient computer received the command. It gathered all the data accumulated over a month's worth of work from 90 punch cards. All routes, all tactics, all programs. Every 0, every 1. It compiled, and it ran. The golem rose fully from the ground. Stones crumbled from its body like dust. It stood on the pass, and its shadow engulfed the Imperial vanguard. The elemental turned toward it. 10 meters of flame against 30 meters of iron. The elemental struck. A pillar of fire crashed into the golem's chest. The black iron glowed red, then orange. The runes on his body flared brighter, and the fire died out. Dispersion runes covered every centimeter of the ancient body. 1,000 years of waiting, 1,000 years of resonance. The runes were perfect. The elemental struck again and again. The golem stood. He didn't move. He just stood there. And every blow dissipated across his body like water on stone. The mage controlling the elemental fell to his knees. Blood flowed from his nose. He had given everything. The elemental flickered, shrank, and faded away. The ancient golem took a single step. The ground shook. The Imperial soldiers ran. They didn't retreat. They ran. 8,000 men turned and fled from the pass like children from a thunderstorm. Daniel stood and watched. Mila stood beside him. Her mouth was open. Her eyes were huge.
Gilroy sat on the ground and wept. Ortan stood with a sword in his hand and looked up at the golem, at the creature of metal and runes that stood over the pass like a monument. Heron stood behind Daniel, as always, a saber in her hand, though there was no one to fight. The golem turned its head. It looked at Daniel, its furnace-like eyes slowly dimmed. The runes faded one by one. Thousands of lines turned dark. The golem froze.
Forever. It had fulfilled the single program it had been waiting for 1,000 years. To protect. And it stopped. Daniel stood there, staring at the lifeless giant. Then he sat down on a rock. Then he lay down on his back. Then he closed his eyes. And slept for 14 hours. No one woke him. The war ended that day. Not formally. Formally, the peace treaty was signed 3 months later. But in reality, it ended the moment 8,000 Imperial soldiers saw the 30-meter-tall golem and ran. Cray didn't run. He stood on the hill and watched, calmly. He took notes. Then he turned his horse around and rode away. He would return, Daniel knew that, but not now, not anytime soon. The following months were different, quiet, the peace treaty. The Khazard Empire was retreating. Not forever, but long enough. Erlin got a breather. Daniel made the most of every day. The apprentices' school opened 2 months after the battle. 30 students, sons of blacksmiths and carpenters, daughters of minor nobles, 7 girls who had nowhere else to go. Daniel taught them, not magic, logic, binary arithmetic, mechanics, how to read a punch card, how to assemble a valve, how to calculate the load on a hinge. Mila became the senior apprentice. She led the classes when Daniel was busy. Once, she debugged a golem from start to finish without his help. The golem worked, smoothly, without errors. She came to him in the workshop. She stood in the doorway. She said quietly, "Master, thank you for not kicking me out." He didn't understand what she was thanking him for. She realized that was the answer. The export contract with Mjoln was signed 6 months later. 50 golems for mine defense. For the first time in a generation, Erlin became solvent. The treasury was replenished. Ivrain smiled. Rarely, but she smiled. Young Lord Aaron was growing up. He turned 16, then 17. He sat in council meetings and listened. Then he began to speak, quietly, calmly. Once he said no to the Council of Barons. Just no. The barons fell silent. Ivrain looked at Daniel. He nodded. The boy was becoming a lord. For the winter fair, Daniel spent 3 nights putting together a gift, a small golem about the size of a cat. It could fetch a book from a shelf and pour tea into a cup, sit at his feet. Daniel brought it to Aaron in the hall. He set it on the floor. The cat golem approached the boy, sat at his feet, looked up with its little runic eyes. Aaron picked it up. He pressed it to his chest. And he cried, like a child, for the first time in 2 years. For a year and a half, he'd kept his composure, in front of the barons, in front of the soldiers, in front of Ivrain. He'd held it together and never cracked. But now the iron cat had sat on his lap and he'd broken down. The Council of Barons watched in silence. Ivrain said quietly, "Gentlemen, she thought that the matter with the stranger is settled." No one objected. A year passed, then 2. Daniel worked every day. The second generation of golems, with feedback. They could report to the operator that they were damaged, request a program update. The command golem coordinated 10 combat golems. This was no longer a herd of mindless machines. It was a legion. Primitive, slow, but a legion. Ayla Verne, the Baron's daughter, came to the workshop a year after the battle. She'd been sent as a soft hostage. She sat in the courtyard with a vacant stare. Daniel didn't know her status. He put her to work punching punch cards. 2 weeks later, she came to him and said there was an error in the 3rd step of the algorithm. She was right. He laughed and said she was fired from her position as a lady-in-waiting.
Now she was a junior engineer. She smiled, for the first time. Sunjin stayed in airline. She didn't leave for the Eastern Archipelago. Her maps became the foundation of the signaling system for the entire northern mark. She drew them in a separate room next to the workshop, quietly, exactly. Sometimes she and Daniel would sit side by side and work in silence, 2 engineers in one room. They were happy. Brana forged, every day. Her hammer rang out against the black iron. She became the head smith of the forge. Gilroy passed the title on to her. He said he was tired. He said his hands had done enough. Now it was her hand's turn. Brana cried. She hid it, but she cried. One evening after her shift, Daniel brought her a piece of a rare alloy. He asked her to break it down into its components. He said she was the only one here who could sense it. He knew it through calculations, but she could see it with her hands. She was silent for 10 seconds. Then she went into the workshop.
Daniel didn't understand why she'd left. Heron was standing nearby. She spoke quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken to him without a reason. She said he was an impossible person. He asked why. She didn't answer. The ancient golem stood on the pass, motionless, extinguished. But even dead, it was a wall. No army in the world would march through the pass past the 30-meter figure made of black iron. A monument, a guardian, a symbol. Daniel sometimes went to see it. He would stand at the golem's feet and look up. He thought about what lay sleeping beneath the mountains. He thought about the yellow light on the dashboard that had flashed in binary code a second before his death. Come, we've been waiting. He had been summoned here. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't magic. It was a calculation. An ancient processor scanned billions of worlds and found a single person who spoke its language. And it called him. Daniel didn't know why. Not yet, anyway. But he was an engineer. An engineer doesn't abandon a project halfway through. The 3rd year, the Battle of Cassard Gate. 300 golems against the Crimson Order, the Northern Alliance against the Empire.
Daniel negotiated on behalf of the 3 states, wearing a leather apron, because he hadn't had time to change. The Empire's ambassadors looked at him, at the apron, at his hands black with dust, at the calm eyes of a man who hadn't slept for 3 days, but knew his terms would be accepted, because 300 golems stood behind him. The peace treaty was signed at dawn. The Cassard Empire retreated beyond the southern passes. Erlin retained its independence, so did Mjoln and Valdemar. The Northern Alliance was now a reality. Daniel returned to the castle. He dismounted in the courtyard. Ivrain stood on the steps looking at him. He walked up and stood beside her. She said quietly that it was all over. He shook his head and said that it was only just beginning. She looked at him. He looked at her. And for the first time in 3 years, he saw not a regent, not a ruler, not a politician. A woman. Tired, beautiful, strong. A woman who had carried an entire kingdom on her shoulders for 3 years and never once asked for help. He said quietly that the lamp was still working. She laughed for the first time in his presence, quietly, briefly. Then she fell silent. Then she said yes. The lamp was working, every night. They stood on the steps of Erlin Castle. The wind from the sea of gray fangs carried the scent of salt. Brana's hammer rang out in the smithy. Gilroy sat by the forge, warming his hands. Mila was teaching a class at the apprentices' school. Sunjan was drawing a map. Isla was punching a punch card. Heron stood by the workshop door, her hand on her saber. Orda was training the recruits in the training yard. The young Lord Aaron sat in the library. The iron cat lay at his feet. Erlin stood, and he would continue to stand